What's going on?
Ooh.
Welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Almost at the end of January. It is Monday the 30th. Lucas and Cameron hanging out with you today.
Yes, sir.
Gonna wrap out our top 20 running backs from the 2022 fantasy football season. We'll finish giving them their job performance reviews, seeing how they actually did this year. I mean, if they're top 20, they probably did good, but you get the point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm at Lucas Wenzel on Twitter, Camlaw FFF for Cameron, FFFellas for her main account, TFFFellas on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas on TikTok, and YouTube. Big announcement coming out next week. Can I tease that? Big announcement next week. Stay tuned for that. Quite literally a week from today, there's going to be a big announcement.
Wow. It's coming up quick.
I know. Isn't that crazy? So if you're not following us on our socials, make sure you do, because we're going to be announcing over on our socials. We'll announce it on the pod too next week. But go follow us on our socials, because that's where the big announcement will take place.
Yes, sir.
We got a lot on the agenda today and very little time to cover it all. We could probably sit and talk about these conference championship games we could probably spend a whole episode on them, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I got lots of news and notes to cover since we didn't cover those last week. A lot of new hirings, and obviously we have running backs, 11 through 20 to cover in this week's episode. But as I said, let us begin by briefly discussing the conference championships from this past weekend. So we had one pretty bad game and one really good game that I was concerned wasn't going to shape up to be a good game based on the first half of football.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start in the NFC. Philadelphia mopped the floor with San Francisco.
Yeah.
Albeit some unfortunate circumstances to make that happen. But, I mean, the way this Eagles team has been playing, I mean, I don't know how much more Brock Purdy could have done to help that 49ers team. 31-7, the final score there in Philadelphia. I think that's there's two big takeaways from this game for me. Number one, I mean, Brock Purdy, the question you need to ask is, does he make a difference in helping this team win the ball game if he doesn't get injured in the first quarter? I don't know if he does. I don't think the score is 31-7, but I still think the way the Eagles dominated San Francisco on defense, or dominated San Francisco's defense through the run game, which is my takeaway number two, the Eagles just had their way on the ground. Like, I couldn't believe it. Jalen Hurts didn't have to throw the football. Like, the Eagles were just tearing them up on the ground, where the 49ers have been phenomenal all season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there was less than 220 passing yards from both teams combined in this game. It was just Eagles play good defense. But yeah, even on that first drive when Purdy got hurt, it wasn't like the 49ers looked like they were going to be moving the ball, right? He got hurt on a strip sack. So where they had tight end blocking Hassan Reddick one-on-one. So it's just... Can
we just acknowledge Arizona? Hassan Reddick's entire career, they tried to make him a stand-up linebacker, and now he's coming off the edge and he's phenomenal. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, and it's just like, I don't know. I don't think that they were really going to stay in this game. I don't, and that... Wow, I can't even talk right now.
Can't even come out with the words.
I just think Philly was, I mean, they moved the ball well in that first drive. They didn't really have to move it after, but they just dominated this game from front to end. And even if Purdy's in it, I still don't think San Francisco wins this game.
No, and Fred Warner, we need to talk about his injury too. I'm going to sneeze. So fill in about Fred Warner, please.
Yeah, he got hurt right away, but he did end up coming back into the game. So that was big. But yeah, I mean, he's the heartbeat of this team. And so if, he's playing banged up at all, that's another huge hit to the San Francisco defense.
Yeah, immediately when he went out, my first thought was, well, the defense takes a massive hit in terms of the secondary help that he provides, right? He's one of the only we saw it against Dallas. He's covering a 35-yard pass to CeeDee Lamb down the seam.
Mm-hmm.
Like there aren't linebacker. He's the only linebacker who can do that in the NFL.
Yeah.
At the level that he does it at. But yeah, like you said, he did come back in that game, but I just can't believe Philadelphia just dominating San Francisco in the ground attack. That just blew me away.
Mm-hmm.
So Philadelphia is the representative for the NFC in the Super Bowl. As for the AFC, it'll be the Kansas City Chiefs, who got their revenge after losing 3 straight to the Bengals over the last 2 years. Harrison Butker, 45-yard field goal to seal the game, 23-20. The Chiefs win in Arrowhead Stadium, not Burrowhead Stadium. The theme all weekend felt like the referees. Maybe more so in this game than the NFC game. I think Kyle Shanahan was reactionary versus actually obviously, like when you're on the sideline, like he's not watching the film in real time.
Mm-hmm.
But he was pretty upset over some pretty clear penalties. Versus in this Kansas City Bengals game, the officiating notorious, people right now on Twitter, on the internet in general, the refs are never going to hear the end of it.
No,
because there were some pretty peculiar calls. There were some missed calls. There were some pretty really? You didn't call that?
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of think the world's overreacting a little bit. The officiating was bad. Don't get me wrong. I think we're overreacting just a little bit. Like the officiating has been worse than this before.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it decided the outcome of the game by any means. I mean, I saw a couple of videos of Bengals fans putting out look how bad this officiating is, and one of them should have been was a major call. I just think, the third down had a lot of people upset where it was like they replayed it, but I mean, you look at the all 22, you can see the back line or back judge coming flying in trying to call the play dead. So that was dead before the play started, and and then that hold on Eli Apple had a bunch of people upset because it gave the Chiefs first down.
It's like around his head though.
Yeah.
That one confuses me. I'm like, if you're around a dude's head, that's holding.
And then everyone's saying they shouldn't have called the penalty at the end, but it's just if you extend your arms pushing a quarterback who's already 3-4 yards out of bounds, it was obvious Mahomes going out of bounds too. That was the thing. It's it wasn't like he was dipping his shoulder to come back in. So I mean, yeah, they're gonna call that one 10 times out of 10. So I just think it was a lot of oh, this should have happened. And if we're being honest, in that first half, the Bengals were lucky to be in it, having had the Chiefs kick field goals both times in the red zone, their first two drives, right? That game could have been 3 touchdown game going into half instead of it was, whatever
13-3.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I don't think the officiating made that game go one way or another, but I just don't think it's as big of a need to react as other people are making it to be.
I think the other one that I've seen float around quite a bit is the no roughing the passer call on Joe Burrow from his own end zone, right? Where, I mean, yes, it's supposed to be within a step, and yes, should they have called it? Sure. You're still telling me they got to drive 95 yards down the field to score. Yeah, I mean, exactly. There's so yes, so much could have happened there if they did get that call, but I don't know. The only call that could have changed the outcome of the game was the Mahomes call at the end where he got shoved out of bounds. But you said, that's going to be called 10 times out of 10.
Yeah.
If you're 4.5 yards out of bounds.
Exactly. You might not like it, but that was the right call there.
Yeah. 100%. So at any rate, I do think the Chiefs played better in this game. Mm-hmm. I do think, regardless of penalties, the right team in terms of how they controlled the game. I think the Chiefs were the right team to win. You can say the refs jobbed the game, sure, whatever. Officiating wasn't great, but just based on the eye test, like Cincinnati did nothing to dominate Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say that about Kansas City too, but okay, fine. Let's bring it down to that last field goal then. That's how it's been the last 3 matchups between these teams. The last 4 if you include this one now. So at any rate, I get the officiating was bad, but I don't want to sit here and piss and moan about it like everybody is doing on the internet today.
Exactly.
So we will get a Philadelphia Eagles, Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl. I do believe the Eagles are favored by 1.5 right now. We can talk more about the Super Bowl in a future episode, but gut leaning right away after these games this weekend.
Kansas City.
I think I lean Philly.
I think this game's about as even as they could have asked for a Super Bowl. So I think this is going to be pretty good.
This is going to be great. Like I said, we can discuss more later, and my gut may change to Kansas City in the next 2 weeks here. We got 2 weeks to discuss it, but those will be your Super Bowl representatives. Our Super Bowl game between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs. Let's keep things moving here. We have some news to cover from this past week, so let's fly through that. So we're going to cover some news from quite literally the past week. Some of it will be old and you've heard it already. That's fine, but we just want to make sure we cover all of it because, like I said, we only did half a week's worth of news, and then honestly, of course, as soon as that Friday episode came out, the world just decided to blow up in terms of hirings and all sorts of other things. So, again, you probably heard a lot of this already, but we're going to make sure we recap it for you. You probably heard already Ezekiel Elliott. He is willing to take a pay cut in 2023. Again, I don't remember if we talked about this on last week's episode, but I think it does make it more likely for Pollard to remain in Dallas this off season.
Yep.
Adam Schefter reported that the Packers won't trade Aaron Rodgers to the NFC. And then, of course, within 24 hours of that report, the Jets hired Nathaniel Hackett as their offensive coordinator. So everybody and their mother is sniffing out that Aaron Rodgers is probably going to land with the New York Jets this offseason. Then again, we said that about Aaron Rodgers and the Denver Broncos last offseason, but I was listening to Unashamedly, the Bill Simmons podcast, mostly because I do enjoy his guests that he brings on. And Peter Schrager did a phenomenal job emphasizing the relationship between Rodgers and Hackett. Like, Hackett has done some incredible things with some offenses. Like, let's not forget he was in Jacksonville when Blake Bortles was there, took them to an AFC Championship, But Rodgers and Hackett, they're tight. Like, this isn't just like Nathaniel Hackett absolutely flopped. Like, these two guys know each other extremely well. And back-to-back MVP seasons with Rodgers and Hackett. If the Jets land Rodgers, like, they become a playoff team.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. I won't say they're a Super Bowl contender. I think that's too far. But if they make this trade happen, it's outside of the NFC. It's an AFC team. You get Hackett and Rodgers back together with Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, who we're going to talk about, back healthy. I don't know, man. We'll see if the Jets actually make the move. They've said they want to spend on quarterback this offseason, and what better way to do that than a man who's due $58 million?
Yeah, and it's got to be. It'd be scary though as the Jets. You know, I mean, Rodgers talked about retiring last 3 years, and Packers want 2 firsts for him. We'll see if they get it, but to give up 2 firsts for a guy that could come in, have a mediocre year, and just say, I'm done. You know, that there's definitely a possibility that happens as well. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how this unfolds, but I do think that Rodgers is going to make sure that he is at the forefront of the NFL news for the rest of the offseason.
He'll drag this out forever. Yep. Literally forever. Joe Namath said he'd retire number 12 even for Aaron Rodgers to come.
It's crazy.
So everybody and their mother is sold Rodgers is going to be a Jet. The Carolina Panthers, they did hire Frank Reich as their head coach. I think that was the right move. Get a veteran guy in. I don't know if he was like cream of the crop head coach, like the number one guy out there, but for a franchise that's been in turmoil for so long, that's been just seeking for some stability and some like almost like experience. Can I just leave it at that? Matt Rule was not that guy. he was the favorite, but sorry, the NFL is not for every college coach. It's a whole different ballgame.
Yep.
So Frank Reich, I think was the right move for the Panthers. It buys them some time at least with an experienced guy. Sean Payton, he's likely headed back to Fox. That doesn't surprise me. I think he's being incredibly picky.
I mean, I don't blame him. There's nothing, maybe you like the Denver deal, but that's probably about it. And so, yeah, I don't blame him for wanting to wait another year for sure, just to see if anything else opens up.
Well, I don't want to work with Russell Wilson if I
Yeah.
go to a team. No, I shouldn't say that, but like when you have other guys, I mean, Kyler Murray is the only other name, but like he's going to miss part of next year. And frankly, I don't want to walk into the dumpster fire that's the Arizona Cardinals right now.
No.
Chargers head coaching position might be open next year. Like I'm not.
That's true.
I told Brandon Staley is
Mm-hmm.
the answer, and just booting Joe Lombardi is what's going to fix their problems. So you're connected to Justin Herbert. Then, like there are certain guys in the league. If I'm Sean Payton, I'd rather be connected to than others.
Yeah,
he's living out in LA, and he can just say, "Oh, cool, Chargers are in my backyard. Okay, cool. Sure, I'll get paid all this money. Sure, they're going to give all the draft capital, of course." But I'm not going to be surprised when he's back with Fox this 2023 season.
Yep.
The Rams, the other LA team, they hired former Jets offensive coordinator, Mike LaFleur, is their new offensive coordinator. We talked about the Broncos a little bit. Their owner, Greg Penner, he met with Jim Harbaugh in Ann Arbor to discuss Denver's head coaching vacancy. No deals or terms or anything discussed, but just something to track. Dolphins make Vic Fangio the highest paid defensive coordinator in the league. It's a big hiring for Miami.
Yeah, definitely.
A massive hiring for Miami. And then lastly, Justin Herbert. He had surgery to repair the labrum in his left shoulder. Sounds like he'll be ready for the team's offseason activities.
Yep.
Other piece of news we didn't discuss, Brock Purdy. No real new news on his injury, but he obviously has time to recover there off season, and he was able to come back and play. Granted, he only threw 2 passes in his return. So that's news and notes from around the league. With what time we have left, let's recap running backs 11 through 20 from the 2022 fantasy football season. So if you're on YouTube, I'm going to be wiping my nose a lot this episode because I don't want to blow my nose on the podcast. I just want to recognize that. I think I've wiped my nose about 8 times. I just sick of congestion and winter weather here in Minnesota. Good thing I think I'm headed to a much warmer place here in literally less than about 15 hours. I will be. So I'll be out the rest of the weekend on the podcast, but I'm here now. I have to tough out Minnesota cold weather. So let's do it though. Let's dive into running backs 11 through 20 from the fantasy football season in 2022. Few players to talk about beforehand. I want to start with Breece Hall.
For sure.
Because he was RB7 in fantasy points per game before his ACL tear this year. 16.3 fantasy points per game. Wound up as a wide receiver, running back 42 on the season. I mean, we can project a little bit what we think his next season will be, or what his season will be like in 2023. Just remember, he's coming off of ACL. You don't bounce back typically right away in the first year, unless you're Adrian Peterson. I still think Breece Hall is probably a top 20 guy next year, but I don't think he's going to make this jump to, the top 7 guy that he was prior to his injury.
Yeah, it'll be something you'll have to watch pretty carefully coming into the year, right? Last year, J.K. Dobbins, or this year was J.K. Dobbins. There was all these things. Oh, he's not going to be ready in time. If he's not ready in time for the start of the season, that should be big red flags. If he's good to go during training camp, keep watching. Keep a watch to it. But if he's good to go, he could potentially finish as another top 10 running back. But I probably wouldn't draft him there, just knowing the risks that come with it. But this is a guy. He was averaging 5.8 yards per carry, 11.3 yards per reception, which obviously in 7 games it's easier to do than over a 17-game season. But still, he is explosive, a home run hitter. You hope that returns. That would be the biggest worry with Breece Hall, is that he's not able to hit that, next gear, that next level. that he had on some of his bigger runs. But yeah, he was phenomenal as a rookie. He was everything you could have asked for if you drafted him.
Yep. I 100% agree. And I was worried about him at the beginning of the year with the gauntlet that he had in terms of the defenses he was playing. Yeah, he was just fine.
Yep.
So obviously in dynasty leagues, you are super excited to have Breece Hall in redraft next year. My guess is that he's going to fall in that like RB dead zone or like right before it.
Mm.
And I'm probably going to be more cautious on Breece Hall than I was this year, but he could just be absolutely explosive next year. We'll see where his ADP winds up, come June, July, August, but just a name to keep in mind there. Jonathan Taylor, the overall RB1 drafted this past year in drafts. Obviously did not play the entire season, but averaged only 13.3 fantasy points per game, finishes a running back 33. You got to think it turns around for him next year, but man, this was disappointing and slightly concerning to see the drop off he had this year.
Yeah, it was probably the worst outcome we could have had for Jonathan Taylor. The biggest thing, it was an ankle injury, and I don't think he ever played healthy after the first ankle injury.
Yep.
So that's something to definitely keep in mind. But this is a guy who's averaging almost 5.5 yards a carry last year. This year he's at 4.5. He was on pace for only 7 total touchdowns on the season, which is obviously way down. And so, his receiving work was all right. Like it was decent, and that's kind of what you're thinking from Jonathan Taylor. Probably close to like Dalvin Cook type numbers is what we're looking at for Jonathan Taylor moving forward. As far as receiving, a guy who we'll talk about on this episode, but very disappointing. But I don't think it's like, oh no, Jonathan Taylor had one flash year and he's done either.
Right. I think he'll bounce back next year, but it was not encouraging for his ADP next year.
No.
Ezekiel Elliott, he's the RB22, 12.4 fantasy points per game. I think that's probably around where he's going to be drafted next year, but he was a guy where, it didn't feel like you drafted him in the 3rd, 4th round this year. I think you're going to be able to get him later than that next year. And I'm probably going to be in on that ADP of like, if I can get him late 4th, early to mid 5th is probably where I'm looking to get Zeke next year. And I think enough people are going to despise Zeke for me to draft him there next year.
Yeah, I would be surprised if he's even drafted that high. I could see him falling closer to the 7th round. You just see people see, he's not the same running back, and we know that.
No.
But if it's him and Tony Pollard again, this guy's going to see probably 180 plus carries just because he's going to be that, early down back. He's going to be the short yardage guy, which he did really well with, right? He had 12 touchdowns this year. It is a little nerve wracking that he only averaged 3.9 yards per carry, but if he's taking a pay cut to come back, that means that he thinks he's going to be used a lot in this offense. So yeah, if he starts dipping down, into those later rounds, he could definitely be just a great depth piece RB3 to have on your team.
Yeah, that's where I'd probably be looking to get Zeke as an RB3 because he was insanely consistent.
Yes.
When he played a good defense, you knew to sit him. When he played a vulnerable defense, you knew to start him. So there wasn't many questions around Zeke. It was just a matter of what defense is he playing this week. And in good matchups, Zeke was playable, borderline top 12 option almost every week.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too next year, like the where we think he's going to finish is going to be much lower. His expectations are going to be much lower, right? We think of like him and Jamal Williams. You think Jamal Williams had an awesome season this year. Jamal Williams finished lower in points per game than Zeke. So, right, I think then we're gonna feel a lot better about Zeke next year just because the expectation is so much lower for him.
Yep. And then lastly, DeAndre Swift. He was the running back 21 on the year, 13.6 fantasy points per game. On Fuego to start the year, 2 top 5 finishes, then gets hurt, comes back, and I thought he was going to be one of the best trade values that you could get prior to his return. And the Lions just decided to not feed him at all. Really discouraging as someone who I went out and traded for in quite a few leagues to make sure I got Swift on my team, and he did not pay dividends. He's so tough.
Yeah,
I want to love him in 2023. I don't think I can get myself there, though. My guess is that he's going to be drafted closer to the running back 20 than he will be. Okay, let's ask this. Will he be drafted closer to RB 25 or 15?
I'm gonna say 15. Just because he is such an amazing fantasy back, right? I mean, he's a guy who can get you 20 points on 9 touches, but he can also, you give him 20 touches, he can put up 20, 25 points. The thing is, we saw it this year, and like you just commented, we had no idea what the Lions were going to do the entire season with him. You never knew if he was going to get 5 touches. You never knew if he was going to get 10 receptions out of the backfield. So that is a scary prospect to have because he was healthy by the end of the year, right? The first half of the year, you're like, oh yeah, he's kind of going back and forth. But towards the end of that year, he was healthy and he was playing that full time, but he just wasn't getting the carries, and he was getting outsnapped by Jamal Williams.
And that's a concerning thing. If Jamal Williams will be back, let's be real.
Yes,
he's
he
not
will.
going anywhere. So how do those two play together? Like DeAndre Swift is never going to be the guy. He's always a threat to break it off from the backfield or from the receiving game, though. And that's why I'm still in love with DeAndre Swift is his PPR upside. But like my guess is, and I say 15 to 25, I think he's probably going to be right around 20. My guess is going to be like the RB, probably like 18 next year is probably where he's drafted. But yeah, just another name to keep on your radar as another guy who's drafted very, very high this year.
Yeah.
And obviously did not return on value. Let's dive into these top 20 running backs, though, as we discuss a few honorable mentions there. Let's start with 11. Dalvin Cook, the Minnesota Vikings. 253 attempts, 1,100 yards, 4.5 yards a carry, 8 rushing touchdowns, added 37 receptions, 295 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 14.7 fantasy points per game. Here's the thing about Dalvin, though. Only 4 top 10 finishes this year. In those games, he had 18 plus fantasy points. Again, that threshold that we talk about. So we're looking at Dalvin Cook, who played 16 games this year, and only 25% of them he was a top 10 running back. This is now the second year he's finished outside of the top 10 running backs. Is this the beginning of the end for Dalvin Cook?
I think it's definitely time to start worrying a little bit. If you're a dynasty manager, it's definitely getting harder to trade him away because people are recognizing, hey, he's kind of slowed down a little bit these last years. Right? He still averaged 4.5 yards per attempt, still had 253 yards, so he's still a good back. It'll just be interesting going forward. How much longer is he going to be commanding 250 yards? Right? There's rumors going around he might be a potential cut candidate for the Vikings this season, although those might start going away a little more with how much the NFL raises salary cap, raising it almost $16 million or something like that this year. But I think next year would be a little bit wary. But I do think he's still for sure a top 15, probably borderline top 10 back again next year.
Who are you going to take, Joe Mixon or Dalvin Cook? Because I think that's the interesting discussion as they finish back to back this year.
So let's say if nothing changed for these two offenses going into the next year, I would still take Dalvin Cook over Joe Mixon.
I agree.
Just because Cook, I mean, obviously efficiency wise, Cook was a lot better, 4.5 to 3.9. Mixon just looked like he never got anything going.
Yeah.
Had his big breakout from one game. Other than that, was just disappointing. And I think Cook's got good enough receiving numbers to, hold up with Mixon in that regard. So I would definitely go Cook.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with you there. Joe Mixon just like Dalvin, I can at least look at his metrics and say I think that's repeatable. For Mixon, I look at his metrics and I'm like, man, unless you get that same number of receptions again, I am concerned.
Yep.
I'm with you there. You drafting Dalvin Cook top 10 next year?
It'll be interesting, right? I think he's gonna be that right on that borderline top 10. I don't think we're gonna see him as a top 5, 6 back anymore. And obviously the last couple of years he had great touchdown numbers, and that's kind of what it comes down to. This is a team now with Kevin O'Connell that kind of gets a little bit more fancy around the end zone, right? They throw to Jefferson. They like to run it with CJ Ham. They like to run it with Kirk. So or not sneak it with Kirk, I should say, not really run it with Kirk. So I don't know if he's ever going to hit that touchdown mark again. So I do think he's going to be kind of closer to that borderline top 10.
My guess is that he's probably drafted RB12 next year because you're going to get some of these young guys sliding up in there that people are going to take a chance on. Like you're going to get some like the Tony Pollard. Well, Tony Pollard may not be healthy. We'll see. It's reported he'll be ready for camp, but like a Ramondre, right?
Yeah.
If a Brees Hall even slides up top 12,
Mhm.
I think he could definitely do that too. But like, there'll be like Javante's of last year, right, where Javante starts creeping up ahead of some of these other experienced guys. Where I'm like, really,
Yeah.
we're drafting the unknown over some of these known commodities. I mean, granted, Javante was injured this year, but like, I think we're going to get a few more Javantes this year that slide ahead of some of these vets like Lenny, James Conner, Zeke, right? I think that's the reality we're going to start seeing for Dalvin Cook.
Yep.
Speaking of Lenny, he was the RB12 this year. Let's be honest, he was saved by his 72 receptions for 519 yards and 3 scores. Can we just say that? Can we just be honest?
100%.
189 rushing attempts. My gosh, 668 yards, 3.5 yards per carry.
Yeah.
He's cooked. He's done, right? Rashad White in town now, who looks a lot better than Leonard Fournette. I'm sorry, he does. He's cooked, right?
Yeah, I would have some real issues drafting Leonard Fournette next year, especially if Tom Brady leaves, right?
Yes.
I don't know if they're going to have another running back come in or another quarterback come in who dumps the ball off as much as Tom Brady. They're definitely not going to throw as much as they have with Tom Brady, right? And yeah, that might lead to more carries, but he's only averaging 3.5 yards per carry.
So much left to be desired on the ground.
And
so much. He looked awful running the football this year. One of the league's lowest EPA per rush attempts.
And if he's going to look that bad, they're going to just pivot to Rashad White right away, right? Why not go to the guy that you drafted in the 3rd round who is actually moving the ball down the field like you want, who looks explosive, who looks like he could score a touchdown.
Who can literally replace Lenny snap for snap.
Yes, exactly. And so I'm not excited about Lenny for next year, that's for sure.
No, I think he's going to fall to like the RB20 range.
Yep.
Depending on what happens this offseason with him. I don't think they'll cut him. They don't save enough money doing it. I'll tell you what, Rashad White sure looks a whole lot better than Lenny. That's what the eye test told me this year. That's what the efficiency metrics told me. It ain't looking good for Lenny. I don't think this RB12 finish is very, 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 very fluky. Miles Sanders. Do we have to? Do we have to talk about Miles Sanders?
I will say, I did say in the beginning of the year, I was backing off on the hate of Miles Sanders. I did not think he puts up 1,200 yards this season.
No.
But it was, it was kind of like this does feel like the ceiling though for Miles Sanders, right? 250 carries. He's always been efficient on the ground, right? He's always averaged close to 5 yards per carry, but it was just like, can he score touchdowns and can he get the carries? And he did this year, and that is why he's up at running back 13, but he's still only averaging 13.3 points per game.
After their bye week in week 8, these are his finishes. RB21, RB11. Okay, that's good. RB39, RB37, RB2. Way to go. RB23, RB3, RB63, 38, 47, 56. In games where he had, even in games where he had 17 or more carries, 3 of them, he was a top 12 running back. And one of them, he was still the RB38. If Miles Sanders finds the end zone, you can count on him. He's like Nick Chubb light.
Yeah, he is. I mean, only had 25 targets on the season. Not even 2 a game.
And I don't think this team even really wants Miles Sanders around. Can I be honest?
I wouldn't be surprised if they re-sign him because I don't think he's going to take – I just don't think he's going to cost the same of like a Josh Jacobs. I think that would be the reason
fair.
to keep him.
I mean, they were looking to trade for Alvin Kamara during
this
season.
True. They definitely were. And I mean, I also wouldn't be surprised if they move off him too.
Right.
You see a Jahmyr Gibbs in the draft, right? If he drops end of second, and I mean even end of third, they might scoop him up there. I could definitely see something like that. Bijan Robinson fell the end of the first. They could think about him there too.
I think it could be sneaky contenders for a guy like Zach Evans, a Tank Bigsby. Just a power guy who can come in, someone not named Boston Scott, right?
Yep. He's not 5'6".
Right, exactly. Who can just plow through defenders because Kenneth Gainwell and Miles Sanders are not that.
No.
And it's not going to surprise me if they're looking for, like you said, even a Jahmyr Gibbs who has you watch his film, balance-wise, a lot of similarities to Kamara.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see what they do in the draft and if they even bring back Miles Sanders.
Yeah, I agree. It would be interesting, if they win the Super Bowl, they might just to
Yeah.
keep, the team together. Even the fact they made the Super Bowl, they might. But this does feel like an offense where any running back who's in it is going to succeed. Not to discredit, Miles Sanders putting up 1,200 yards is impressive no matter what. But you look at like the Ravens as well. Devonta Freeman last year when he was the starter was the running back 16.
Right.
So it's just offenses like this when you have this good of a O line and running quarterback like this. Any running back you plug in is going to be pretty good on the ground. But when you have running quarterback, they're also going to lose touchdowns. Jalen Hurts had 13 rushing touchdowns this year, 14 to conclude the playoffs, and he only saw 25 targets. So both of those are definitely going to be a little bit disappointing for any running back who's on this Philly team.
You're not drafting him top 15 next year, though, are you?
No. Now with the upside, it's like, you look at like ETN. I would take Kamara ahead of him. I take Cook ahead of him. I just don't know how repeatable this is going to be for Miles Sanders.
Yeah, to go from 0 touchdowns to 11.
Yeah.
I think the expectation needs to be somewhere in the middle, like 7 or 8, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he hits double-digit touchdowns again, which, you even look at in terms of fantasy points, right? I don't want to take away when a guy does good. I don't like that's not the purpose of this exercise. But if he goes from 11 to 8 touchdowns, we're taking away 18 fantasy points there. We're talking borderline top 20, which is where we're talking about Miles Sanders being this entire season. He can be efficient. He can have all these rushing yards, but unless if he gets that receiving work, like this is probably close to his ceiling, if not his ceiling exactly.
Yeah, like you said, Nick Chubb light, so you need a touchdown for a good game. And if we're going to bank on who's going to score a rushing touchdown, it's going to be Jalen Hurts or Miles Sanders 10 times. So that is a little more worrisome as well.
Najee Harris was the running back 14 this year. Can you believe that? Remember we were talking about him being outside of the top 25 running backs after being drafted like top 5?
Mm-hmm.
What a bounce back. 249 rushing attempts, 954 yards. Efficiency sucked as we all expected. Receiving work plummeted down as we expected. 9 total touchdowns on the year. 13.1 fantasy points per game. Part of the reason he made this big comeback, he was the RB7 after week 11 this year.
Mm-hmm.
You have like a glimmer of hope he's still a top 10 running back?
I do, just because that is when Kenny Pickett kind of got settled into this offense. That is when we saw him, not like, I don't want to say take a step forward, because it's not like Kenny Pickett all of a sudden became this great offensive, this great weapon. But, he was a serviceable quarterback who could move the ball down the field. Steelers offense kind of started coming around. And that's what Najee's going to need is touchdowns to be relevant. Because the efficiency is just not going to, I don't believe watching him play that it's ever going to be great. I don't believe he's ever going to be a 5 yards per carry kind of guy. But I do think he's going to continue to get the volume being a former first round pick. So the yardage is going to be there if the touchdowns can keep up. I think that these receiving numbers are probably closer to what he's going to be at next year as well. So it's going to depend on touchdowns. I think he could kind of, finish there with a lower points per game, but just because of the fact that he doesn't miss a game or something like that. But I think if you draft him probably around that Joe Mixon range, that probably feels appropriate, probably just ahead of Joe Mixon, because they feel very similar.
I think it does come down to touchdowns for Najee, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Yep.
Again, 6 rushing touchdowns on the year. Only 1 rushing touchdown prior to the bye. 6 touchdowns, 6 rushing touchdowns after the bye.
Yeah.
Only 1 receiving touchdown after the bye, 2 prior to the bye. But I don't think that's where Najee's going to make his bread. I do think it's going to be, if they get in a scoring position, let's just feed Najee the ball. You even look at his touches. Only 2 games of more than 15 rushing attempts in the first 8 weeks of the season. From week 10 on, 20, 20, 10, 17, 12, 24, 16, 22, 23. Finally, they're starting to get him, those 18 plus touches. And in those games, you saw Najee put up, top 15 finishes, which is what you had been longing for all season.
Yeah.
And I think it does come down to touchdowns. Like I think we can boil that down to if Najee is scoring touchdowns, he's getting you fantasy points. So which is like a no duh, Lucas, great analysis. But like for a guy like Najee who has no efficiency, you either need the receiving work like Leonard Fournette, or you need to score touchdowns. That's just how it is.
Yeah.
So I think it does come down to touchdowns for Najee, and if this offense starts finding the red zone more, which is totally possible next season with Kenny Pickett a year under his belt, I think we could see a top 10 bounce back. My guess is that Najee will probably be in the probably like 10 to 14 range would be my guess for running backs. It's not going to surprise me if he's like RB9 though off the board.
Yeah. Listen to this. So last 2 seasons, the only real difference is that he had 30 attempts last year. He averaged 3.9 yards per attempt and a long run of 37 yards this year. 30 less attempts, so he had about 100 less yards. Yards per attempt is 3.8 and a longest run of 36 yards. So he's the same running back he was last year. He just saw less volume. And then again, 30 less receptions, about 40 less targets, so about half the receiving yards. And both seasons, he was right around 6 yards per reception. So nothing changed as far as system. It was just this team ran less plays. So Najee Harris saw the ball less. And so I think that's kind of what this is more going to be indicative of who Najee is going forward than his first season.
So, yeah, I again, that makes me think he's going to be drafted between probably 10 and 14.
Yeah.
I don't think he goes any higher than that.
No, I would say that's probably about his route.
The RB 15 on the year. The man nobody thought was going to do it. Jamal Williams. Leader of the hidden village of the D. 6 top 10 finishes, 6 games of 18 plus fantasy points. Really, only 6? It feels like Jamal had more than that. It feels like he had like a couple massive, massive games. 246 rushing attempts, 994 yards, almost 1,000-yard rusher. Here it is, though. 15 rushing touchdowns.
16. This, for some reason, I don't think his has week 17. Or no, so he had 17 because it doesn't show week 17 stats for some reason.
Correct. For whatever, for week 18. Yes.
Week 18, that's what I meant.
Yeah. We pulled Love Fantasy Pros, but for whatever reason, they don't have week 18 metrics in there for like basically anybody who was in a top 10 running back. It's weird because I had to fix that with Joe Mixon last week.
Yep.
I digress. 17 rushing touchdowns. Only 13 fantasy points a game, though. Look, I don't know. Like, how much stock do we put into Jamal Williams for next year? Because, like, we may get. I don't want to bank on a full season of DeAndre Swift. We haven't seen that yet. But when he's on the field, like it's tough to see Jamal Williams having top. I don't see Jamal Williams a top 15 value. Plain and simple.
Yeah, if he has half the amount of rushing touchdowns from last year, so let's say he puts up 8, he is going to be right around the running back 30 spot. So unless we think he's putting up, insane rushing touchdown totals again, I don't think he finishes this high. Like you said, DeAndre Swift plays a full season. You got to think that's a little different. Swift averaged under 9 touches a game or 9 rushes a game. You got to think that number goes up a little bit. So I don't see him maintaining anything in the top 20. So I would definitely think he's closer, probably a top 25 running back next season.
I'm worried he's going to be overpriced in drafts next year.
I think he's gonna be that guy that people are gonna be like, oh, look at James Conner, right?
Yes.
James
that's perfect.
But you look at the difference. He hit Jamal Williams only saw 16 targets. He only saw 3 targets the last 9 weeks of the season. This is a guy who doesn't catch passes, so unless he's scoring touchdowns, he's not getting that same fantasy relevance.
That's such a perfect comparison because I think that's what people are going to come back to. Like, oh, look at that. He just has a knack for the end zone. To which I say James Conner was the Arizona Cardinals' entire offense last year. Like, Like, that's not how this works with Jamal Williams.
No.
There's Amon-Ra St. Brown, and granted, DeAndre Hopkins in Arizona. Okay, sure, you can count on me with that. Jameson Williams will be back. DeAndre Swift is there.
Yes.
They have other sneaky playmakers on that team. So it's yeah. I fear he's going to be overdrafted next year. Speaking of a guy who I was concerned about being overdrafted coming into this year, James Conner. So RB16 on the year, albeit he only played in 13 games, averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game. So again, it's just a matter of James Conner just nothing excites me about him. 183 carries, 782 yards, 4.3 yards per carry, 7 rushing touchdowns, 46 receptions on 58 targets for 300 yards, caught a touchdown there as well. I don't know, man. As long as he's in Arizona, I'm kind of convinced he's going to hover right around this top 15 range. Like, I don't see anything that like prevents me from drafting him there. Injury, sure, but like, I don't know, man. When I get a healthy James Conner, like I'm getting a top 15 running back, it feels like most weeks.
Yeah, it'll be the interesting thing next year will be no Cliff Kingsbury, obviously, and Cliff was notorious for running inside the 5. And then report just came out about Kyler Murray. I just remember this about he is going to probably take his recovery a little slower. He's not going to try and rush back.
Good for him.
Which I don't blame him either. You look at a guy like RG3 playing on an injured knee ruined his career, and for Kyler being able to scramble is probably the biggest part of his game. And so, no Kyler, Cliff gone, but it's going to be him and Marquise Brown. So you got to think, hey, he's probably going to be this running back 15. So maybe you get a discount because of that. If he starts falling, 16, 17, 18 running back, oh my gosh, you just got to think he catches passes out of the backfield and scores touchdowns. What more do you want from a low end RB2? Like if you go 3 running back or 3 wide receivers right away, James Conner could be sitting there end of round 4, beginning of round 5, and I definitely scoop him up for that price.
Yeah, I feel like he's going to be this like discount 0 RB running back next, where it's like you're not going the full 0 RB, but you walk in the first round with the JJ, CD Lamb, come back in the 3rd round with if a Michael Pittman, the Chris Godwin is there, right? Someone along those lines.
Yeah.
Then you get a James Conner to fall right in your lap. Like that's going to be mighty tempting. Even if it goes to Kelsey, you get a CD, right? Like there's ways to fill out your team where like, okay, James Conner can be your RB1 and you're stacked at every other position.
Yeah.
That is if he falls, closer to that 17, 18, 19, 20 range. But like I could see people biting on James Conner right around the RB13. And I saw that in plenty of drafts where James Conner drafted well ahead of ADP.
Yeah, I think he's definitely an interesting one.
Yeah. I don't want to make a prediction on James Conner because again, I feel comfortable drafting him right around where he finished this year. I think that's where like my line is on James Conner. That being said, if I get a fully healthy James Conner at that price, I mean, we're talking about a guy who has potential to be top 12 next year because it could just be, let's feed James Conner near the end zone. Let's do short dump offs because Colt McCoy can't throw the football down the field.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, but it is, are we ever going to see a healthy James Conner, right? Last year, he missed 2 games, and that was the most games he's ever played in his career. So it's how likely is it that we're going to see a healthy James Conner? But that's probably going to be baked into his draft price as well.
Yes. Yeah. Again, we're prematurely discussing ADP. I'm really curious. As we discuss these players, I'm like, man, I'm actually really curious to see where these guys end up because I think I might have some stronger opinions than people may be ready for going into next season. The RB17, Travis Etienne, 213 rushing attempts, 1,100 yards. He averaged 5.2 yards per carry. That was phenomenal. Only 5 rushing touchdowns though. Didn't catch as many passes. 33 for 299. The yards per reception was pretty good, but 12.5 fantasy points per game. Is Etienne going to be one of those guys who like creeps up to be the top 12 running back? I brought up the young guys earlier in the episode who are going to creep ahead of the Dalvin Cooks, the Joe Mixons of the world. Is Travis Etienne going to be one of those guys next year? Because I fear he is.
I think he's going to be drafted as top 7 running back next year. I think he's going to be I just think people have been so excited about him all year, right? We knew that from the beginning of the year. You had the Etienne truthers. You see a guy averaging 5.2 yards per carry. He's probably going to be the lead back in this Jacksonville offense that everyone's really excited about. I think he really gets a lot of hype going into this next year. I'm not saying I draft him there. I'm probably more comfortable drafting him 10 or 12, right? He only averaged 12.5 yards per game. The yards are there. It'll remain to be seen, is he going to score the touchdowns? And the receiving work was underwhelming, to say the least, for Travis Etienne, right? This was a guy people were hoping we get 60 receptions a year, and instead he's sitting at 33. But I think that people see the upside of Etienne, and I think he's going to be pushed really high in drafts next year.
I think for sure he'll go top 12. I don't know about above like RB 8 or 9. But I do agree. I think people are going to be all over Etienne next year. He's going to be a guy I don't have many shares of. I can already tell you that.
Yep.
Because as efficient as he is on the ground, in games where the Jaguars fall behind, they just don't use him.
Yes.
That's the problem. You look at the games, let me pull up his stats, because I am almost positive. In games where Travis Etienne got at least 18 rushing attempts, that dude was a machine.
Yeah, he was.
Maybe not even 18. Maybe it was only even 14, because he was incredibly efficient. Yeah, here we go. Running back 8, he had 14 rushing attempts in week 7. Week 8 against Denver, 24 rushing attempts, the RB7. Week 9, 28 rushing attempts, the RB3. 22 rushing attempts in week 16, the RB15. Otherwise, we're looking at 4 attempts, 9 attempts, 13, 8, 10, 10, 14, 11, 2, 13. You get 17 and 19 where he was RB22 and the RB48. 9, 7. He was the RB5 against Houston, but that's because the man was he actually got utilized in the passing game and he was averaging 12 yards a carry.
Yep.
Again, this is a Etienne showed out against Denver. But you look at the other defenses that he played. The Jets, you can run on the Jets a little bit. Houston, goodness, you can run on Houston. Vegas, you could run on Vegas. Denver was good for him. The Giants, you could run on the Giants. So I just fear people are going to be too optimistic on Etienne for these boom weeks, and then you look at his other weeks and you're just let down. There's nothing special about him.
Yeah, I would agree. And the reason I say running back 7 is where I think he could be drafted is you look at it, you got Austin Eckler, Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Saquon, maybe throw Josh Jacobs and Nick Chubb in there, and then Jonathan Taylor. So there's 7. So he could be right around that running back 8, right? Ramondre Stevenson, people are going to have reservations about Tony Pollard, Aaron Jones, Dalvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Najee Harris, even Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall. I think he could be right in that area where people are just so optimistic and down on other guys that he just gets elevated that level where he is overdrafted.
He's next year's Javonte Williams.
I would 100% agree. I would agree with that. I'm
not going to say he's going to get injured early next year. That's not what I'm saying by that. But in terms of the optimism and how his ADP spikes up, I think that's going to be Travis Etienne. And it's going to be higher than Javonte at RB13 this year. Javonte was. I fear it's going to be top 12, top 10 for Travis Etienne, and I will have 0 shares of him.
Yeah.
Alvin Kamara was running back 18. We only have a few minutes left here. Let's fly through these last ones. Well, one we really don't even have to discuss, but
yeah.
Alvin Kamara. Here's a question I want to ask about Alvin Kamara, because again, when we heard the suspension was being pushed back, Kamara's ADP spiked up. RB12, I believe. Only 3 top 10 finishes. Only 4 games with 18 plus fantasy points. I mean, this was just awful. Only 2 rushing touchdowns on the year for Kamara. You like the passing game usage. 56 on 75 targets for 47. Only 2 touchdowns there, though. We missed 14 games, or we only get 14 games from Kamara, so we miss him for 3 games. But I'm sorry, only 14.3 fantasy points per game. I didn't draft him as my RB1. I took him as my RB1 in quite a few drafts this year because he was falling early second round, and I was willing. If I had a late pick, you best believe I stacked Stephon Diggs, Jamar Chase, and Alvin Kamara in quite a few drafts.
Yeah.
At any rate, Travis Kelce I did that with. I had Travis Kelce and Kamara. I finished 3rd in that league, but man, I was lucky I drafted Ramondre Stevenson. At any rate, I'm rambling. Here's the question I want to ask about Alvin Kamara. What's the panic meter level out of 10 on Alvin Kamara going into next season?
Dynasty standpoint, you got to be a little panicked if you have him. You understanding he's probably going to face a 6-game suspension this next year. We can't forget about that. Redraft, he might become a value just because of the suspension, right? We saw that with DeAndre Hopkins this
Yeah.
year. I'm not saying he's gonna like Hopkins came back and was wide receiver 1. He was. I mean, he was putting up 19 fantasy points a game, but I think he could definitely be a value going forward. I think he's probably got one more good year in him just because of receiving work. You got to think. Hopefully, he sees some more touchdowns. But he's definitely not the same top 10 guy we've been used to. Yeah, I mean, 200 carries, he only gets 4 yards per carry. The one thing I think that is good for Alvin Kamara is their cap situation is so awful that I don't think they bring in another running back.
No, they won't bring in another guy. Out of 10? So in redraft.
Redraft out of 10, I'm probably getting pretty close to like a 6 or 7. Probably right around where I am with Joe Mixon.
Redraft, I'm sitting at like a 7.5.
Okay.
I'm not going to want many shares of Kamara next year, even if I can get him at a value, because I fear he's still going to be drafted at like 18, and I'm not going to want to take him there because I'm not going to have him for 6+ weeks.
Yeah.
And if I'm getting the efficiency he was at right now, that's not going to return on RB18 value. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah.
Dynasty, where are you at?
Dynasty, I gotta be 8 or 9 if I have him right. I mean, you're looking. This might be one of his last great years, and he might be out for half of it. So, I would be hoping that there's still someone optimistic about Kamara in your league and trying to give him to that manager this year.
We've seen that happen in our dynasty leagues, where people have already been ready to move off of Kamara. Let me ask you this: what are you looking to get in return? Because I feel like we can say sell Kamara in dynasty. Because I agree, I'm at like an 8.5 in dynasty for Kamara. What kind of draft capital? And I'm going to say draft capital because, frankly, the players I think you're going to get back just aren't going to be worth it. Here's a player. Would you trade Dameon Pierce for Alvin Kamara?
Ooh, probably not. I know I could get more years out of Dameon Pierce. Maybe. Man, it depends. I mean, if I'm rebuilding 100%, but Dameon Pierce worries me because on the Texans, he just wasn't like crazy efficient this last year, and I just worry how long until they replace him with someone else. That just seems to be the Texans' way. It's just rinse and reuse. So that does worry me. But I'd probably hold on to Kamara. As far as draft capital, if you could get like a 24 first for him, I probably would. But I think that would be the most you're going to get for Alvin Kamara. I don't see many managers wanting to trade Kamara or wanting to give up a first, especially this year for Kamara right now.
Could I interest you in Alvin Kamara for Brian Robinson in the 204?
Brian Robinson, the 204. I would be tempted. I would, as the Kamara manager, I think I might hold off on that. See, I struggle so much giving up players like Kamara for draft picks. I know I probably should. I know it's probably smarter in the long run, but Brian Robinson just doesn't get me excited. That's the thing, right? Brian Robinson, I'm not like, oh yes, he's gonna be putting up crazy numbers. He's gonna be an average running back who's not getting great receiving work. So that's kind of where I am with that. But that is probably the line that you're gonna have to walk when you're trying to trade Kamara.
I just fear you're not going to get anything better than that because you're going to be, if you're trading him away, my guess is that you're probably going to be rebuilding and people are going to look to give you young assets. And these are some of the young assets that you're probably going to look to get into return. Dameon Pierce, I mean, again, I don't think it's a guarantee he's the starting running back for the Houston Texans next year. Can I say that?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree.
I don't think it's a guarantee. Brian Robinson, I think he'll be the lead guy in Washington, but again, he's not a guy who gets you excited. He doesn't catch passes. And the 204 could be anybody, from who are we looking at in the 204 range? Alec Pierce last year to like even Sky Moore, who was drafted tail end of the first round last year.
Dameon Pierce was there too.
Dameon Pierce was there. Tyler Algier. I mean, there are some decent guys in there, but again, nobody that you look at that mid-second round and you're like, man, I'm stoked to get somebody mid-second round there. But I think that's the best you're going to get for Kamara because I don't think anybody wants to actually give up quality assets to acquire him right now.
Would agree.
All right, let's keep moving. We're touching an hour here. Kenneth Walker, the RB19 on the year. He only had 3 top 10 finishes. That shocks me.
I know. That's what I thought too.
200 rushing attempts, 936 yards, 9 rushing touchdowns. Caught a few passes. 14 games active, but remember, he really didn't come on until week 6? 13 and a half fantasy points per game. Ken Walker is going to be one of those guys I think that creeps up into that top 10 range. He'll be drafted ahead of guys like Dalvin. That'll be drafted ahead of guys like Mixon. If he creeps ahead of Najee, even, I'm not going to be surprised. You agree with that?
Yeah, and he's definitely a guy who you're more excited about in games like we talked about with ETN where they're winning. Because when they're winning, he's can see 23, 24 attempts. Especially if they're playing an underdog. In wins, I'm just doing quick math off the top of my head. I mean, it looks like he was around 22 attempts a game.
Yep.
And you got a guy averaging 4.7 attempts, right? You're already at 100 yards, probably going to throw in a touchdown there. It'll just be remain to be seen. Can the receiving work catch up enough that he is going to be worth it in those dip games when there are get behind quick?
Yeah, that's gonna be the thing with Ken Walker. I think the potential is unlimited with him. I think Seattle could, going into year 2, I think they could totally get one of Ken Walker's best years out of him. Now that they won't have Rashad Penny there to compete with him. They could just give Ken Walker the load. They could really just build on what they're already like surviving. Can I say surviving? Like,
yeah,
I don't know. Like, obviously playing above expectations, but like, if they're hanging on to a playoff spot right now with the team that they have and the draft capital that they have this year, like, I think the only way is up for this team. So like, I don't think it gets worse for Ken Walker. I think it only gets better. And with the talent you saw from him this year, like, he's a guy who I think, like I said, probably could creep up to that, maybe not top 12, but like 13, 14, 13, 12, 11, somewhere in that range. And again, I'm not going to be surprised if he gets drafted ahead of guys like Dalvin and Mixon next year. I'm just not.
Yeah.
Like, the age is showing on those guys, and Ken Walker is still young and could arguably produce his best year.
Yep.
RB20 of the year, Jerick McKinnon. I don't care. I mean, phenomenal stretch, 3 straight games as the RB1. I mean, the receiver clearly, like, you want an example of receiving work being king in fantasy football. See Jerick McKinnon. I mean, 512 receiving yards, 68 targets, 54 receptions, 8 receiving touchdowns. I mean, we're talking like, I want to know where he's at in terms of wide receivers, just on that receiving work alone. We don't have to do that right now, but 70 rushing attempts, 285 yards, 4 yards a tote, 1 rushing touchdown. My guess is that McKinnon still goes undrafted next year. It's a nice finish. It's a nice little story, but my guess is that McKinnon is going to be drafted as like an RB4. He feels like a JD McKissick.
Yeah, I mean, he's the same age as Cordell Patterson. He's 31. You got to think Chiefs are looking to bring in another running back. We saw it last night. They couldn't get anything growing on the ground. And if you want to keep a dynasty going, you need to be able to run the ball at least a little bit. So, got to imagine he's not seeing 1B work next year as the running back in Kansas City.
Bijan Robinson to the Kansas City Chiefs.
Gosh, that would be fun. I don't know if they commit to that, but boy, that would be fun to watch.
I'm going to keep whispering it into existence. I don't have the 101 anywhere, but man, that'd just be fun to watch from a football perspective.
It would be a lot of fun.
To the Chiefs.
Yes, sir.
Anything you want to add before we wrap up here?
No, I think it's just keep watching the news. Keep tuning in to the podcast, hear the latest news. And just be throwing up, especially if you're in a dynasty league, just be throwing out some trades. Just some borderline ones, because you never know how people are going to value certain players. They're going to value certain picks. And everyone values things different, man. That's what we've learned the most from our dynasty league is everybody values picks, players very differently.
Yes.
And someone might overvalue one player and then severely undervalue a different player. So it's always good to just either ask or throw out a trade offer. Just kind of feel the waters.
And now is the time people are going to be willing to sell and move some of these guys too before too much news comes out about them this offseason. 2022 is still fresh. They're not looking towards the future as much. Some people could still have 2022 fresh in their minds, and it's a good time to capitalize potentially. So, I would agree with that. Let's close it out there. FF Fellas on Twitter, the FF Fellas on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas on TikTok and YouTube. I am out the rest of the week. Cameron will be back later this week, hopefully with Tyler.
Try our best.
Maybe. Try your best.
Try our best.
We'll dive into the top 10 wide receivers later this week, though. We'll give them their drop performance review. But yeah, that wraps out this episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. We will see you later this week. Two Stooges being dudes here. Tyler, get back on a pod.
Come on, man.
Quit caring about other sports. Quit being nice to middle schoolers. Two Stooges being dudes, Fantasy Football Fellas. We'll see you later this week. Deuces.